At this point, I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker this evening, the nationally renowned attorney in the field of civil rights and law, Sahar Aziz. She joined the faculty of Texas Wesleyan University last year as an associate professor of law. Prior to joining Texas Wesleyan, she was an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University Law Center, where she taught national security and civil rights law. Professor Aziz served as a senior policy advisor for the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Department of Homeland Security. There, she worked on law and policy at the intersection of national security and civil rights, something of acute concern to everybody in this room, including me. Prior to that, she was an associate at a law firm in Washington, where she litigated class action civil rights lawsuits alleging a nationwide pattern and practice of gender discrimination in pay and promotion. She began her legal career by conducting internal white-collar crime investigations and an independent investigation on child trafficking in the Persian Gulf. She's also clerk for the Honorable Andre Davis on the United States District of Court for the District of Maryland. Professor Aziz's legal scholarship focuses on the intersection of national security and civil rights law, especially as applies to the post-9/11 era. She incorporates critical race theory, feminist theory, and constitutional law into her examination of the unequal impact of the post-9/11 laws and public policy on ethnic, racial, and religious minority groups in the United States, and I think we all know who that means. She analyzes those issues in various contexts, including immigration, counterterrorism, criminal justice, and civil rights litigation. Professor Aziz has also applied her scholarship in the American context towards her work on the rule of law and democracy in post-revolution Egypt. She's been featured on C-SPAN and Al Jazeera's English programming and has published numerous commentaries on national security and civil rights issues on CNN.com, the Houston Chronicle, the Huffington Post, TruthOut.com, AltMuslim.com, and the American Constitution Society's blog, Jurist, and The Guardian. She's presented her work in forums including congressional briefings, the highly prestigious Aspen Institute, and conferences held by the National Endowment for Democracy, the American Bar Association, the National Employment Lawyers Association, and the Texas Bar. She earned her JD and her MA in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Texas and her BA from there as well. She's a board member of the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association, which I think it makes it clear that she has to get by without sleeping. Maybe she'll tell us her secret and enlighten us on a lot of other things. Professor Sahar Aziz.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for inviting me into your community today and giving me time out of your busy lives to discuss something that affects all of us, Islamophobia and what we're going to do about it. But first, I'd like to thank Brother Dawood Walid and Sister Suhaila Amin and Layla Amin and the board of the CAIR Michigan chapter for all their hard work in bringing us together today. And I want to recognize Imam Siraj Wahhaj. Imam Wahhaj is one of America's few remaining courageous voices, willing to speak truth to power, despite the government's efforts to harass and intimidate him into silence. He is our Derek Bell, who challenged the structural racism embedded in American society that impeded it from attaining the greatness that it seeks. And before Derek Bell, there was Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, who, despite adopting very different tactics, both agreed on one thing: making America live up to its aspirations of equality and justice for all, not just for the rich, not just for the men, not just for the whites, and not just for the Christians, but for all Americans, no matter what land you hailed from or humble beginnings from which you came. And prior to Malcolm and Martin, there was W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who emphasized educating newly freed African Americans, whether through the vocational trades or the universities, to empower them to have the tools needed to defend their rights in a society that vilified them as barbaric, violent, and biologically inferior. But it was not just men who paved the way so that we could all enjoy freedom, but also great African American women like Sojourner Truth, who was a trailblazer in the abolition movement and the women's rights movement. In her famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" Sojourner defiantly proclaimed, "Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman." When she demanded equal rights for black women, she decried the racism in the American feminist movement and the patriarchy of the church's leadership that led to the exclusion of women as leaders in society and religious communities. And when black men were lynched by the thousands, it was Ida B. Wells who fought fearlessly to force white Americans to face the brutality of their acts. And of course, we must recognize Rosa Parks, whose simple but powerful act of refusing to move from her rightful place in the front of the bus triggered a civil rights movement to which all of us here are beneficiaries. Now, after their death, these men and women were hailed as heroes. Statues are built in their name, and memorials honor them. But we should never forget that during their lives, these men and women were vilified, attacked, spat on, investigated, persecuted. They were viewed as troublemakers. They were called traitors. They were accused of criminality and subjected to malicious prosecution and public defamation. We must never forget their sacrifices, because our freedoms today exist because these individuals and countless others of various races and ethnicities paid a heavy price so that we could enroll in universities, ride wherever we want on the bus, eat at whichever restaurant we want, live wherever we want, practice our religion, and be free to express our disapproval of government action. Their sacrifices prove that freedom is not free. But fighting for justice, whether as a lawyer or a responsible citizen, has its cost. And there isn't one of us who doesn't have figurative scars on our backs. But we are willing to pay the price because we have a moral obligation to protect our children from the systemic civil rights violations unleashed on our community because a handful of criminals committed an atrocious terrorist act. We simply cannot and will not accept guilt by association based on false stereotypes that we are categorically terrorists just because we're Arabs or Muslims. We must demand to be judged by our individual actions and the content of our character. Now, we also have an obligation to our children and our grandchildren to be vigilant in protecting our freedoms, because our freedoms belong to us. They do not belong to the government, and they don't belong to the bigots. Our rights to speak freely, associate with whom we choose, and practice our faith are inalienable rights. But through the specter of national security, our government has used fear to cower Americans into giving away their civil rights and liberties, notwithstanding that these rights are exactly what make America a success and a world leader. So don't let anyone fool you into believing that your human rights are a privilege. They are rights, and they're rights that have to be guarded at all times. Now let me pause a moment and tell you about an experience that shaped my perspective about America. Now, as an Egyptian-born American Muslim, I have been very lucky to have traveled to different countries and to have seen the diversity of cultures and people in this world. And one doesn't really fully appreciate America, despite its flaws, until one lives abroad for an extended period of time. So when I was a new college graduate, I had the typical travel bug that comes after 4 years of isolation in a library and the rarefied environment of a college campus. And I remember thinking, I don't care what my dad says, I'm getting out of here and I'm going to see the world. Right about then, I was offered a job in Bahrain, to my father's chagrin, of course. And I didn't hesitate to take the opportunity to explore a part of the world that I'd never seen. And I'll always look back on my days in Bahrain with fondness and love for its generous and kind people. And Bahrainis welcomed me as one of their own and never judged my eccentric Egyptian-American worldview not to mention my Muslim feminist philosophy taken from legends such as Fatima Mernissi and Nawala Saadawi. And indeed, it was my love for Bahrain that inspired me to write my report, Citizens Not Subjects, debunking the sectarian narrative of Bahrain's democracy movement, where I challenged the Bahraini government's pretextual invocation of sectarianism as an excuse for engaging in brutal human rights violations. And unfortunately, the same lies are perpetuated in Syria and other countries that are engaging in an uprising. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because I'll never forget how homesick I was by the end of my stay, which was something I hadn't anticipated. I longed for the cultural diversity of America, where I could go to any restaurant I wanted and be served from food from nearly everywhere in the world, where I had friends whose ethnic origins crossed continents, and each one brought with her a unique outlook on life. And a place where centuries-old traditions didn't hold you back. They didn't control your future. You were encouraged to be creative, a critical thinker, an entrepreneur. So living outside of America gave me a newfound commitment for America's founding principles and values. After witnessing the debilitating, chilling effect that comes from government censorship of speech and association, as we've seen in Saddam's Iraq, and Gaddafi's Libya, and Mubarak's Egypt, and Bashar's Syria, I realized how fragile our First Amendment rights were. It was at this point that I decided that I would be willing to persevere the wrath of bigots to defend the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, and the right to be free from government persecution. I would be willing to do it for my children and future generations because past generations did it for me. So yes, when we acclaim Siraj Wahhaj, Jeremiah Wright, Derek Bell, Malcolm X, Ida B. Wells, and Angela Davis, we too will become subjected to the defamation that comes from those who seek to destroy this country's founding principles of freedom. When we recognize intellectual giants such as Edward Said, Tariq Ramadan, or John Esposito for their groundbreaking work about Arabs or Muslims, we too will be attacked as a means of silencing us from exercising our First Amendment protected rights. And if you are afraid to exercise your rights, you have no rights. Now, those who attack Muslims willing to dissent with government policy or expose anti-Muslim bigotry, they're transforming America into a land of intolerance and oppression and intellectual desolation. These are the same people who, despite claiming to defend their country from us dangerous Muslims, are in fact destroying America with their vitriolic rhetoric and their divisive political agendas. Now, when a movement's sole objective is to stop mosques from being built in the United States, the First Amendment is under attack. They are not patriots. They are not protecting national security. They are bigots, and they're Islamophobes. They deserve the same place in history as the Ku Klux Klan. And similarly, when an organization such as the misnomered Florida Family Association makes it its mission to fight the humanization of Muslims on the reality show All American Muslim, they should be called out for what they are: bigots. Let's be real, folks. If hosting a show that portrays various Muslim families raising their kids, participating in civic engagement, and doing other mundane and frankly very boring American activities, no offense to Hayla or Laila, if that's considered a threat to national security, then just being Muslim is a threat to national security. And some Americans have made that claim in their demands to exclude Muslims from America. If it were legal to strip us of our citizenship, they would do it. And then they would deport the Mexicans and the Jews and the blacks and the Asians and the communists and anyone that they didn't like. But so long as we have the courage and conviction to defend our rights, their intolerant, hateful America will never come to fruition. And then there are the purported patriots who have made a living, quite a lucrative living, out of hysterical accusations that American Muslims are stealthily imperializing the United States because they want to conduct their personal affairs in accordance with their religion. So by seeking to have your marriage contracts, your wills, your divorce proceedings, your food preparation, and other personal affairs comply with Sharia, American Muslims are purportedly threatening the American way of life. That's right, folks. By exercising your First Amendment rights protected by the Constitution, you are usurping the Constitution and the political system. Now, any reasonable person can see the irrationality of this argument. It is irrational because it is racist, and racism is irrational. It's illogical. It's also destructive. If we prohibit Muslims from conducting their personal affairs in accordance with their religion, then we will eventually start doing the same to Hasidic Jews, Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Mennonites, and any other religious minority. It's a slippery slope, and it ends in the very type of religious oppression that the Founding Fathers sought to prevent when passing the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So that begs the question, who's really threatening the American way of life here? Is it those who respect the space for individuals to decide for themselves how they want to manage their personal affairs within the bounds of American law? Or is it those seeking to forcefully impose their faith on others? The answer is quite clear. It's the latter. So, as Americans who happen to be Muslims, we cannot allow the bigots and their hateful agendas to sow intolerance and suspicion of entire communities simply based on their religion. We cannot allow them to set the precedent of opposing building of houses of worship based on false stereotypes that millions of Muslims are terrorists just because a handful of criminals who happen to be Muslim committed horrendous acts. And more importantly, we must take our responsibilities as citizens very seriously. And that includes preventing our government from succumbing to these bigots' agenda by spying on Muslims en masse without any individualized suspicion, without any evidence of criminal activity. We must work with our allies in the interfaith community, the racial justice communities, and other communities of various races and ethnicities to hold our government accountable for infringing on our constitutional rights. Because racial discrimination is invidious. It creates classes of haves or have-nots based on the color of their skin, where rights are only granted to the privileged and powerful at the expense of the subordinated and the poor. This is not the America envisioned by those who sacrificed their lives to be free. Nor is it the America that many of our parents and grandparents immigrated to for a better future. So the message to our government should be unequivocally that if you suppress religious freedom, if you censor our right to dissent and disagree with your policies, then you will not receive our vote in the ballot box, and nor will you receive our donations to your political campaigns. And we will mobilize to elect responsible public citizens that prioritize protecting the U.S. Constitution. And we will sit CAIR and Dawood and Lena on you in the media to expose your irresponsible and divisive behavior. Now, that brings me to the challenges of American Muslim communities. Unfortunately, we have failed to organize effectively and fully leverage our political power. There are more than 3 million Muslims in America, and many of whom are affluent and concentrated in cities such as Detroit, Los Angeles, New Jersey, New York, Chicago, Houston. They can impact local and state elections. They can make a difference with their vote and with their political contributions. In the Detroit area alone, there are hundreds of thousands of Muslims from various races and ethnicities who are Sunni and Shia and Sufi. The Muslim community in Detroit is a microcosm of the world. But with diversity comes the temptation to segregate and manufacture petty intra-community disputes. And those Islamophobes would like nothing more than for our communities to fight with each other so that we remain weak and we cannot effectively stop the violation of all of our civil rights. Government informants and provocateurs would like nothing more than to divide us into the good Muslims who never criticize their government and the bad Muslims who are accused of harming the community and the country because they will not stand for discriminatory practices and they call out the government for abusing its authority. They would like nothing more than for you not to financially support CAIR-Michigan, because then you would not be able to protect yourself against these civil rights violations. So do not fall for these traps. Embrace your differences and unify under the common goal of protecting freedom for all Americans. Now, the Muslim community also cannot afford to exclude the millions of intelligent and highly qualified Muslim women from community leadership. Whenever you go to a community event and you do not see that 50% of the leadership are women, then you have to recognize that something is amiss, because we are 50% of the population. The Muslim community is being denied the value of Muslim women's skills, their commitment, and their intelligence. Muslim women are doctors, engineers, lawyers, entrepreneurs, with much to offer as leaders of their communities. They deserve a place at the table, and those who deny them their place are part of the problem, not part of the solution. Now, in light of the pervasive anti-Muslim bias boldly expressed by politicians and presidential candidates, our communities cannot afford to divide ourselves based on petty personal conflicts or insecurities. Our children's futures are at stake. And I have 3 beautiful children, alhamdulillah. So these are very personal issues to us. And as we witnessed with the brutal murder of Trayvon Martin in Florida, our children's lives are at stake as well. Sadly, Trayvon is not the first, and nor will he likely be the last young black man subjected to excessive force because he was stereotyped as a criminal based on the color of his skin. Similarly, scores of men and women have been physically attacked and some killed because they are stereotyped as terrorists. Just yesterday, as Dawood mentioned, 32-year-old Shayma al-Awadi was beaten to death in her house in California after receiving a threatening note telling her to go back to your country. You are a terrorist. Another note that said the same thing was found next to her unconscious body lying on the floor in her home. Shayma wore the hijab, and unfortunately is another casualty of the alarming rise in violence against headscarved Muslim women, who are marked as terrorists because of their religious attire. In my recent article, From the Oppressed to the Terrorist, which I hope that you will look at, I document case after case of headscarved Muslim women harassed, spat on, beaten, and in Shayma's case, killed, as a culmination of the hateful anti-Muslim bigotry permeating the blogosphere and the political discourse. It is time to wake up. How many more women must be beaten before we unite to stop the hate and the violence? How many more Muslim kids have to endure the bullying and stigmatization before we say enough is enough? Kifaya. As Muslims who strive for justice in this world, we have a moral obligation to condemn the brutal murder of 16-year-old Trayvon, a young African-American man shot in the back while attempting to escape from his aggressor. Because if we want justice for our sons, we must demand justice for all sons. If we want others to see the humanity in us, we must honor their humanity. Raise your voices against systemic and structural racism that incarcerates en masse African American and Latino men. The same laws that selectively enforce anti-terrorism laws against Muslims, while white supremacists and militias continue with business as usual. Raise your voice against anti-Latino work raids and mass deportations that are based on the same broken laws that profile and deport Muslims. Do not fool yourselves into thinking that our problems are different than their problems, or their cause is different than our cause. There is no us and them. There is just us, Americans of all hues, religions, and national origins on the same ship. And if the ship sinks, we all sink together. Injustice for one is injustice for all. Thank you very much.